Hi, I'm Ali Words, and this is Last Unrifled Yaw. Last Unrifled Yaw is a podcast where we have conversations about video art, experimental music, avant garde literature, performance art, and the occult. If you or someone you know would like to be on Last Unrifled Yaw, please get in touch. Taylor Ellwood is a prolific occult author and magical experimenter. We talk about will based versus identity based magic, ways to direct the organic development of identity, and high magic versus low magic. Hey everyone, this is Ali Words, and today we have Taylor Ellwood. Taylor, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, I am Taylor Ellwood. As duly noted, I am a magical experimenter, an author of both fiction and nonfiction books, and an occultist and artist, and many, many other things. But I think that kind of gives you a good idea to start with.
Yeah, you've done quite a lot of stuff. I don't think I've read your latest books, but yeah, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got into, you referred to yourself as a magical experimenter.
Mhm.
What
Yeah.
what brought you to that?
Well, when I first started practicing magic, I was 16 years old, and I started out with a combination of neo-shamanic techniques and elemental hermeticism, which is a pretty unusual combination back then because most people were getting into Wicca. And I mean, from the start, I think I was kind of drawn toward experimenting with things. You know, what I would do is I would read the books and I would try the techniques out, and I would try them again and again and again, really just to get a solid understanding of what was happening, what kind of experiences was I having. I was recording things very carefully because I really wanted magic to be real. I had actually, I grew up in a not so great situation, and I think magic for me was kind of a way to have some sense of empowerment. And I had always wanted magic to be real. Even like as a little kid, I wanted magic to be real. So when I found out that magic was quote unquote real at 16, I was just glued to it at that point. I was like, I can finally find the answers to my questions. I can finally get a sense of empowerment. And so I would say, at first I just religiously followed through on doing the exercises as they were. But I would say within a couple of years, I started to question, the different exercises I was doing. And the thing that I kind of came away with is, are there better ways to do this? Can I experiment with this stuff? And because I was self-teaching myself, I didn't have anybody there at the time to tell me, no, you can't. Now, I think I'm not going to knock people who have the fortune of getting trained by somebody else, because sometimes that can be a good thing. It can be a very transformative experience. But I think that when you have that kind of freedom where you're not taught by somebody else, it actually is helpful because you begin to the only limit that you really have are the limits that you yourself come up against as a result of the experiences that you have. You don't have someone telling you not to do things. And what I found is that when I did inevitably meet a couple people who became early mentors, that their attempts to restrict what I did ultimately pointed to a lack of creativity and imagination on their part, which, if anything, just further illustrated to me the need to continue to teach myself. And even now, I mean, I do have a couple of mentors now, um, and I love them to bits. They're great people, and I've learned a lot from them. But it's very interesting to come up against some of their attitudes and perspectives and see, this is where they're limiting themselves, and I haven't limited myself this way. And I think this is true in general of people, that when you work with other people, you definitely come up against the limitations and boundaries that each person has. And we're all limited and bounded in some ways. I mean, I'm sure that if I were to teach somebody right now, if I were to, like, say, take someone under my wing and start teaching them magic, inevitably there would be things that they would discover with me, where they would be like, these are the areas where Taylor's weak in, or these are the areas where Taylor is closed-minded or whatever, and there would be some truth to that. So I think but at the same time, I think that I did get the gift of being extremely open-minded, and willing to experiment precisely because I didn't have somebody in my life telling me what I could or couldn't do. I just had books, and the thing is books are easy to question and examine, and you can find the gaps in the literature pretty easily.
For sure, yeah. What does your practice look like more recently? As recent as you're comfortable talking about?
Right now I'm doing this. It's I guess like a year and a half kind of thing where I'm working with a demon a week with the Goetia. So it's like working with the 72 Goetia, and so I'm learning about them in a lot more depth, and that's been kind of interesting. And part of that is research for a future book that I'm going to be writing about working with demonic spirits. I've had plenty of experience with the Goetia even before this particular thing, but this is kind of factor. I always like to dive in deep in terms of the research that I do. And then I am working, I'm doing a lot of Qigong. And what I'm doing is I'm merging and melding Qigong with Western magic. So I'm doing a thing called the Sphere of Art, which is a hermetic Western magical practice that I learned from one of my mentors. But what I'm doing is I'm melding that with Qigong. And then what I'm really working on the threat. There's two things that are the thrust of this, and all of this work is kind of focusing on it. One is an embodied experiential practice where I'm really bringing the practice into my body more and more, and working through my body, and really relying upon opening myself up to the hidden matrices of sensorial awareness that are available to us, but that we often block out because we live in a very busy world, and we've been filtered by that world. And then the other thing that I've really been working on is an approach to magic which is not will based. It is an approach to magic that is identity and alignment based, where you basically create the experience by surrendering to the experience instead of trying to impose your will upon the experience. You learn to work with the experience instead of trying to force the experience to happen the way you want it to. And that's been the thrust of my work over the last few years.
Interesting. So is that how you're treating the demons of the Goetia? Like, are you surrendering to like Paimon or whatever? Or
It's more like I'm working with them. I'm developing a collaborative relationship with them. So I hesitate to use that word surrender because it's not quite accurate, but it's the best word I have right now to describe some of the overall approach to magic. It's not really surrendering. It's more like it's learning to collaborate and work with instead of trying to work over or impose upon. Unfortunately, the English language is somewhat limited in terms of what it describes, but really it's just this idea of collaboration and being with the spirits, being with the world around us, being with other people, being instead of doing, it's all about being. How do we how do we become, how do we shift who we are in order to manifest what we want, as opposed to I want to manifest what I want because I want to manifest what I want upon the world around me and force the world into conform and into conformity with my desired wishes.
for sure, yeah, that's definitely how I approach magic is more of changing yourself such that you become the kind of person that manifests the thing that you were trying to get.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that current has always been there to some degree. It's just unfortunately that the will based current is much more prevalent in Western magic and occultism. And I think that you see that with a lot of different brands of or currents of magical work where that focuses on that. And it's something that I think is needed more of, and it's good to see it when you can encounter it, because I think it's we need less will, we need less of an imposition on will, because we see the results of that when we look at the world around us. We see what has happened when humanity has tried to impose its will upon the world around it. It is not working out in a way that's really favorable for us. It's just producing more of a mess than anything else.
Interesting. Now, There are many different definitions of will, but I'm curious, is there a sense in which you are imposing your will upon yourself in attempting to do what you're describing?
No, I don't think so because the will here's one of the biggest problems with willpower and a will-based approach to magic. Your willpower is incredibly weak when you think about it. We have to make tons of decisions every day. And each decision you make takes a toll. What clothes am I going to wear today? What am I going to eat this morning? When am I going to go and do Qigong? When am I going to go for a walk? All these different things, all these little different decisions. Am I going to turn left here? Am I going to turn right there? Am I going to do this or that? All these things play a role upon, taking away our ability to make decisions. If anything, learning to surrender to the experience, learning to work with the experience, to work with the current and kind of going with the flow takes away a lot of that. And it's not about an imposition of will upon yourself. It's more about a relaxation and release of the will and a recognition that you don't need the will in order to work magic. You don't need to force something into place. You can simply become part of the experience. And I'm not going to say that I have this down perfectly. I mean, I don't. I'm still figuring this path out. It's something I've been figuring out and working with since 2017 to one level of success or another. And I would say that sometimes it's worked really well, and other times, I've definitely gone back toward the will-based approach at times, and I found that, why have I done that? And I'm like, oh well, I ended up doing that because I really wanted this thing or that thing. But what's interesting is that when in the last few years, when I review the will-based approach to magic versus the other approach, I find that the will-based approach seems to work in the short term, but then it backfires in the long term. And the reason why, I think, is because when your identity isn't in alignment with the changes that you want to manifest, you might manifest those changes for a time, but inevitably that part of you that wasn't in alignment with it is going to fight back. And that in and of itself shows that the problem with a will-based approach to magic, because if you're not fully in conformity within yourself with what you want, you will find a way to sabotage it. And I've seen this, and I've observed this not just in regards to myself. I've observed this in regards to, other people, where I've been kind of watching this very carefully, and I'm like, huh, this person tried to get X to happen, but they weren't ready for it. And as a result, they had it for a while, and then they lost it because they weren't ready for it. They couldn't, they weren't ready for what they wanted because they hadn't done the necessary internal work. They hadn't done the necessary identity alignment and things like that. And so it's kind of like it's an interesting realization when you see it, because then you're like, well, wow, if that happens a lot, then this explains where, you have this approach to magic that ultimately is very short-sighted, because it's focused on the immediate gratification and not on the long-term experience, and understanding that fundamentally, to achieve a long-term experience, you have to be willing to change as well. And if you're not willing to change, if your sense of identity is static, that will ultimately work against you.
For sure, yeah, I've definitely experienced that directly where like I do a sigil to manifest a specific result and it works really well for like a couple weeks. And then for whatever reason, it goes away. And I, but interestingly, the way I viewed it is I've always framed this topic in terms of high magic versus low magic. But I think you're making an interesting move by describing it in terms of being will-based magic, or I'm not sure what term you want to use, but we can call it non-will based magic
I might call it
temporarily.
identity-based magic. We'll call it that.
Identity-based magic. Okay, I like that. And I've always viewed it in terms of trying to cultivate the kinds of wisdoms that cause you to attain the result. And that frames my earlier question, because I've always thought of it almost as enacting your will upon yourself, where the result that you're manifesting is your own internal change.
Mm-hmm.
But you're describing a similar but slightly different thing where you're not enacting your will upon yourself to manifest the internal change. You're sort of letting go of will in order to allow your identity to shift.
Yeah,
Hmm.
because I think that when you impose, even when you impose will upon yourself, it you're trying to force something to happen. Whereas when you let go of will and you shift, you naturally shift, and you do it because there's this organic, authentic connection that you want to manifest within yourself. You don't force it, but instead you find the intrinsic motivation. It becomes much more powerful. Whereas if you're trying to impose your will, it's like trying to quit smoking or quit drinking or something like that, where yeah, I'm not going to do this thing. I'm going to force myself not to do it. Well, the problem is that you're putting all that decision making power into it. And that decision making power is getting worn away by all the other decisions you're making during the day. You're not going to win in the end. You're not going to succeed. I know that sounds harsh and brutal, but it's simply true. You're working against your biology in a very real sense. And what we have to learn how to do, and this is something that I think a lot of people still don't fully grasp, um, in in our modern times, is that we have to is that, even with all the technology that we have around us, we are biological beings, and we're not going to get away from that anytime soon. Even with the transhumanist movement, where there's a desire to integrate technology into biology, there's still a simple reality that you're dealing with biology. And the biology that we're dealing with is something that has evolved over a very long period of time, but in some ways it still hasn't evolved. I mean, we can see that with our emotions and how we handle situations. We have an emotional makeup that was designed around surviving in the wild, hunter gatherer type of thing. I got to go out there and eat. I got to go out there and procreate. I got to go out and do these other things. And we still have that. And of course, we're in the 21st century here, and we have all this technology and all these other things, but still, we're still dealing with our biology. So what we have to do, we have to learn how to work with our biology, work with the world around us, work with our identity, all these other things, work with, collaborate with, create consensus. Because when you create consensus, then you're able to shift reality. You're no longer fighting against what you have within you, and you're not fighting against what's around you. And that's the problem with will. With will, you're fighting against what's within you and you're fighting against what's around you. And so it'll work in the short term, but in the long term, it will ultimately fail.
Interesting. Yeah. Anyone who's heard me talk about this before, I tell them that they should just try to do high magic, but then people argue about cultural issues regarding high magic. But I have two questions for you, and you can answer to any combination of either.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what is your conception of identity? And then also, if identity, assuming you let go of will and your identity organically develops, um, I can definitely imagine ways an identity can organically develop that would be unpleasant or at least not desirable.
Mm-hmm.
How do you direct that organic development without the use of will?
Okay. First, I want to speak to something about the high magic thing and people's weirdness around that, because I think that was an interesting comment that you made. I think that people get weird about stuff like that because they are associating specific categories of or definitions with the term high or low. And I think the best thing we could do is strip away the categories and the definitions and recognize that these are artificially imposed, will based, will imposed, if you will, upon our sense of what these things are. Like, what is high magic? What is low magic? Do we even need high or low magic? What is it that we're really trying to achieve? That's the question to be asked, I think. And how much of these categorical definitions do we need? And as someone who has relied upon definitions a lot, and sometimes still does, to understand things, because I think I have found that that is kind of one of my areas where it's like, okay, if I define something this way, then I understand it. I've also really come to recognize the shortcomings of definitions. definitions can provide a very strict boundary for you, but they can also provide loopholes. And the problem is, a lot of times we end up exploring those loopholes because they're like, well, this definition applies this way, but it doesn't apply that way. And this leads into your question around identity, because I think a lot of times our notions of identity are definitely based around a definition of identity. For example, I am Taylor Ellwood, or you are Allie Words. Well, what does that really mean? Is that describing the essence of who we are? Not necessarily. I mean, Taylor Ellwood is a very transitory identity. At the end of this life, Taylor Ellwood will die, and whatever I am or am not will move on to whatever is next or what isn't there. There may be a lingering echo of Taylor Ellwood for a while, if people continue to read my books or listen to this interview or whatever else. But at the end of the day, at some point I will pass on. My identity as this physically based rooted being will be gone. So I think that that's kind of an interesting thing, that identity is simultaneously a very powerful thing, but it's also very transitory. I think that our exploration of identity in life, we're given this opportunity to live this in this material world, and it's a miracle when you think about it. And yes, I know some people might have a knee-jerk reaction to that word miracle, because there's associations with that. But I really do think that if you consider it, if you're a spirit, you do not have flesh. You are not able to affect the world around you in the same way that we are. Or you live in a different plane of existence. I don't know. I'm not a spirit. Well, I am a spirit. I'm a spirit made flesh, I guess you could say. But I'm not in the spirit realm right now. I'm in this world. But the thing is like we have this material existence that we're able to impact. I can pick up the book that's next to me and I can put it down. I can talk to you on this thing and we can create this audio, do all these other things. And that is an example right there of identity being made manifest. The very act of living is an act of manifestation, an act of identity. And identity itself is a form of manifestation. So if we consider that identity is manifestation, the thing that we want to also consider is that identity ought to never be static. Manifestation ought to never be static, and it won't be static. We can approach identity from a place of stillness. And I think stillness is a great place to start with magical work, when you can bring everything within yourself to a place where you can just be still and be in the environment with you. Be with yourself, be with everything else. And then, okay, now I'm going to work with this, and I'm going to move, but I'm going to move with purpose and consciousness. And I'm going to move with the world around me and with whatever it is I end up working with, and work with it in a way where it's collaborative and ongoing. And I'm going to be open to the changes as they show up. Now, this is the second part of your question, but what happens if those changes aren't pleasant? Well, let me be honest here. Life isn't pleasant. People, at least in American culture, they want to be happy all the time. They want things to be, happy. They want to smile on their face, but we're not built for happiness. There's a book I'm reading right now called Bittersweet by Susan Cain, which I highly recommend, called How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole. The truth is, you're going to have experiences that aren't perfect. You're going to have experiences where you fail. You're going to have experiences where things don't work out. And this is part of life. It's what you learn from those experiences that matters. I have this magical working that I do called the Elemental Balancing Ritual. It's in my latest book, Walking with Elemental Spirits. And this is a ritual I came up with in 2004, where you work with an element for at least a year. The first year I worked with water. Next year I worked with sound, and I worked with other elements throughout the years. Every time I've done this practice, I've had things occur that I didn't expect or necessarily want, but that they shape my identity. I've been working with Truth and Connection for the last 2 years. I'm going to be wrapping up in October. And let me tell you, working with Truth and Connection is tough. I have gotten divorced. I've had a breakup. I've had a lot of changes to who I am in this discovery of truth and connection. And I can tell you, I knew when I set out to work with truth and connection, I was warned by the spirit that I was working with. He's like, "Are you sure you want to do this? This is going to change your life in ways that you like, profound ways, like deep ways." And it did. I have gone through so many changes in learning to work with truth and connection, but what I have come out of, and these changes have been bittersweet and hard. I want to make no they've not been easy. I have come face to face with my flaws and fallibilities in ways I never had before. I have come to know myself intimately in a way I never have before because I've ultimately learned how to connect with myself. And I've learned to see past the illusions of my own life. I've learned to see my truth. And yet I'm also coming out of this with this conscious awareness of these weaknesses and these flaws, and it's helping me become a better person. It's helping me transform who I am. But it's not easy. And it never will be. Like if we go through life wanting things to be easy and perfect and go down this wonderful path, I have news for you, sunshine. It isn't going to happen. It's just not. Life is not easy. Living life is not easy. And if whether you practice magic or not, you're going to have experiences occur. You're going to say something at the wrong time. You're going to do something that you didn't mean to do. You didn't mean to hurt somebody else. You did it. You did something. You might, in my case, you might be somebody who is a codependent person who wants acceptance from other people and tries to and ends up being a problem solver. The problem with problem solving is, and I've come to realize this, is I'm not qualified to solve anyone else's problems but my own. That's been a harsh truth that I've come up with because I realize how trying to quote unquote give people advice or solve problems for other people is really just extending myself beyond it's like pushing into other people's identity in a way that they don't necessarily want. It's not honoring their identity. Talk about an example of will-based thinking, right? I can solve that person's problem. Well, no, you really can't. You know, I've come to realize that. I've had to learn that the hard way. I've learned it through some hard lessons in this last year in particular. And it comes at a cost. The changes that we bring, the identity, it does come at a cost. But I think that in the end, it's what we do with that cost that matters. Do I continue to be unconsciously incompetent? Continue to do the things that end up that create a life that I don't want? Or do I become consciously incompetent, where I start to become aware? And you might think consciously incompetent doesn't sound that great, Taylor. But let me tell you something. It is better to be consciously incompetent than unconsciously incompetent. Because when you're consciously incompetent, you at least are aware of the issues. You're aware. You may not have a solution for them. And that's where you have to solve your own problems. That's the thing. You are qualified to solve your own problems. You're not qualified to solve anyone else's problems, but you are qualified to solve your own. It might take a while for you to solve them, but you are qualified. And that's that conscious incompetence is that awareness. And then eventually conscious incompetence changes to conscious competence. You start to discover, okay, here's what I can do differently. Here's how I can change. You throw magic into the mix and magic just brings this out even more. I mean, that's all magic really does. Magic just brings some weirdness into the play and it brings things front and center. And that's what this work with truth and connection has done for me. It has brought things front and center for me. I'm coming out of this in a much, much more humble than when I went in. And I've already gone through some humbling experiences by this time. I mean, from 2017 on to 2022, it has been, I have definitely been put through I've definitely had my illusions about myself stripped away. I have come face to face with all the ways that I don't believe my press release anymore. Let me put it that way. I don't think I ever will. But I've really come face to face with that. And I think it's worth it. It's hard. But this is the thing about working with identity. When we work with identity and when we work with different things that can help us come face to face with our identity, we're going to go into a crucible and we're going to come out the other side. And if you're not willing to do that work, if you're always going to try and keep your identity static, you're just going to keep replicating the same patterns over and over again. And your life isn't going to change because you're not changing. And that's a shame because you are losing out on something magnificent and amazing. You're losing out on the chance to discover not just who you really are, but but your place in the world and your experiences with other people and how those things can transform and truly become something empowering for all involved if done right.
For sure. Yeah, I agree with everything you said. But I have to admit, when I said pleasant or undesirable, I had a slightly different connotation in mind.
Well, tell me what was that connotation?
What if someone whose identity is shifting towards something like alcoholism or some form of political extremism or something else that will be grossly detrimental to them and the people around them? Because for me, a lot of the point of what I'm calling high magic is an effort to direct the evolution of your identity in ways that I'm going to call wise for lack of a better term, not to imply that uh, I have capital W wisdom, but there are definitely, I'm going to say, worse ways that your identity can unfold. And that's what I seek from high magic is directing the unfolding of identity such that I bring myself to what I'm going to call a better life.
Agreed. And I would agree with that statement. That's what I seek to do as well. I mean, it is ultimately to live a better life. As I shared previously, I mean, what I shared previously may sound a bit discouraging to people, and so I want to just point out that this is the reason I point that out is because I don't want people to go in with the notion that they're not going to go through growing pains. Magical work and just life in general brings with it growing pains. But the growing pains and the experiences you have along the way, if you're smart, they will lead you to that wisdom that you're talking about. You will become wiser and smarter and better for those experiences. But, okay, so political extremism or alcoholism or substance abuse or sex addiction or any of those other things, right? Well, that's a lot of times that's when people are ruled by their appetites. They let their appetites dictate their reality, and that's a form of identity work for sure. You know, someone who needs to get up and have a drink each day, or or can't get through a day or a week or a month or whatever without a drink is a good example of that. I actually am right now on an alcohol fast myself. I haven't had alcohol for the last month or so, and I typically go through this on a regular basis. Like when I got divorced, I went through an alcohol fast. I did not have any alcohol for a while because it was like drinking is not going to help me with the situation. It's just going to numb the pain, and that's not what I need. I need to be with the pain that I'm experiencing. And it's been the same thing with this alcohol fast. I've been like, no, other than I should say that no, I should say I did have alcohol the other night. It was a full moon ritual. I did that, but that was a magical working, and I was actually doing that as an offering to the spirits I was working with. And so I did partake of a bit of alcohol then. And it was interesting to note that like after a month of not drinking, like, wow, I'm really feeling this in a different way than I did before when I might have been having a bit more. So it was kind of an interesting experience in of itself. It's always useful to track those kinds of things. But I think that when people are ruled by their appetites, that is a form of identity. It's often a thing, or ruled by their demons, and often it's something where they, there's no easy answer to that. I mean, what do
Right?
you do in that kind of situation? I mean, I grew up with an alcoholic parent. I know what alcoholism looks like. And he died of his appetites in the end. Um, like he loved alcohol, he loved really fine food, everything else, and he died of diabetes and kidney disease because he could not control himself. He had no discipline. And I was going to say, well, isn't discipline a form of will? Not necessarily. I think that discipline is when I get up each day and I do qigong, I'm not forcing myself to do qigong. I've just made it part of a background thing that I do. Um, Maybe initially I am, when I first start out, like, oh, I got to get up and do that. And that's where will comes into play, but ideally, you shift from will to discipline. And discipline is where you build healthy habits in your life or unhealthy habits. I mean, you can be disciplined and be unhealthy. Get up there and do that drink a day, like, hey, you're definitely disciplined about the drinking, just not necessarily going to be a good thing for you. But when you don't have to force yourself to do something. When you just do, when you do something and it just becomes part of your life, it becomes part of your identity. So, you get up and you're like, I'm going to go and I'm going to, I'm going to do I'm going to do Qigong. And you don't even think about it. You don't even think I'm going to do Qigong. You just get up and you do Qigong. It's just part of your identity. It's part of what you do because it's something that makes sense to you. That's where discipline can come into play, because discipline is kind of one of those things where it's like I have made this part of my identity, and I have become it has become who and what I am, and I am simply portraying this in the environment around me, and doing what I need to do. In contrast to that, I mean, though people are often haunted by their demons, and I mean, this is part of the work. Is like when you find, for example, that you're driven toward alcoholism. I mean, why is that? In my experience, when somebody drinks to excess, they're not they're not drinking because they really enjoy the alcohol. They're drinking because they want to escape from something. They're drinking because they want to salve whatever is going on within them. They want to numb it. They don't want to be present with it. They don't know how to be present with it. And they're in so much pain, whether they realize it or not. And a lot of times they don't even realize it. It's just, oh, I'm gonna drink. But it's like, and how do you get away from that? I mean, the real challenge for that person is, how do I become present with myself and with the things that I don't like about myself? How do I become present with things that I've been avoiding with this? It's the same thing with somebody who does an excessive amount of entheogens, or somebody who goes out there and has lots of sex. At a certain point, the excess takes away from the enjoyment. You're no longer really enjoying it. You're not with it in a way that's really meaningful. For myself, when I do drink alcohol, I like to drink alcohol for two reasons. One is the shared social experience, enjoying something with somebody. The other experience is just the taste. A really good wine tastes great, and there's something about savoring that taste. But it's interesting, if you drink more than a little bit of that wine at a certain point, you start to not really enjoy it. You start to get really buzzed. You're not enjoying it for the taste anymore. You might be enjoying it for the fact that it's creating an altered state of awareness for you. But the interesting thing about that is that altered state of awareness leads to less filters too. You're less and less filtered in a way. Um, and when I use that word filter, I guess I would say that the societal norms and things like that become less and less important to you. But it's interesting too, because that can, in and of itself, be a revealing of things, whether you realize it or not. But it also can also become addictive in its own way, because it's like, okay, to get in touch with myself, I have to do this. Well, not really. You don't have to do that. You don't have to drink to excess in order to get in touch with yourself. And you're not necessarily even getting in touch with yourself. You're getting in touch with an illusion of yourself. Yes, I'm drinking a lot, but I'm feeling, and I'm feeling this way. But then, like, the next morning, the hangover that you get isn't really worth it. Because when you wake up with a hangover, you're like, oh man, I don't have enough water in my body. I'm not hydrated enough. But man, I just feel really crappy. My body doesn't feel good. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to feel that way. I mean, it's not a fun experience, and it's like, what did all that drinking get you? So I think, it's interesting. Like, if you look at something, like at what people do and why they do it, they'll tell you different reasons. But like, really look at the heart of it. What is that activity achieving for them? What's the result? What is it that they're ultimately experiencing, and what aren't they seeing about it that you would hope that they would see? Those are things that are good questions to ask. You don't have to drink or do drugs or do anything else to open yourself to the world around you. Now again, under the right circumstances, these things can serve as a performative aid in ritual or magical work or other things. I'm not trying to discourage that if that's what you want to do, but understand why you're doing what you're doing and what it's getting you, and where it's getting you. Because these things can be very transformative in good ways, and they can also be very transformative in bad ways. And it's the bad ways where your appetites control you that can ultimately lead to your demise. And I think this is also true of political extremism. People who get wrapped up, whether it's far left or far right, and I don't want to talk about politics too much on here, but I'll just say that when people get wrapped up too much in a particular political view, they've often created a tunnel vision for themselves around what they see and what they don't see. And it's very easy to say, be us versus them, us versus them. And what they have lost touch of is the shared identity that we all have. You may not agree with that person's perspectives, and that person may not agree with your perspectives, but there is still something that you share, a common bond of life. And if we can't find where we can meet in the middle, if we can't find a place where we can meet and collaborate, then what ends up happening is the kind of polarity that we see right now in the U.S. that is not helping at all. It is just dividing people further and further, and that's all I'm going to say about politics because I really didn't want to go there.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's important to talk about it in the abstract, I think, because I think you're right that the appetites are in a large part what drives people to different forms of political extremism. But I don't know.
Really,
Yeah.
it's true. I mean, look at the appetites. People people are driven by their appetites a lot of the time. This goes back to my point about biology. And this is why we have to learn to work with our biology and recognize the way that our biology drives us. But instead of having it like control us, we need to learn to work with it so that we can come to a collaborative relationship where it doesn't control us anymore. It's something
You
that we work
actually
with.
you developed a system magic that does that. I hesitate to say literally, but certainly metaphorically.
Yeah, inner alchemy of life, working with the neurotransmitters and the microbiota of the body. That is part of the work. The work I'm doing in general with experiential embodiment, and working with the body is another part of that. I mean, I'm really trying to develop what the work for the rest of my life is what I'm working on right now. It's interesting. You know, um, when I first started out with magic, I wrote pop culture magic and I wrote space time magic and stuff like that. And these were much more external facing things. I'm still going to write another book on space time magic, but it's going to be rooted in this experiential embodiment work. Um, and I find really anymore that my work has shifted so much that like my early work, it's still relevant in the sense that I'm proud of it and I'm glad that I did it, and it's relevant work to people who need it, but it's not the work I'm doing anymore. And I was actually going to write a book on social media magic, and I've realized I'm not going to write it. I have no interest in it anymore. I started to write it, and I'm like, this isn't what I'm being called to anymore. Someone else can write that book. I've got to write. I've got to do the work that I'm doing, and it's this experiential embodiment work. And if and when that shifts to something else, and it might, fair enough. But right now, this is the work that's calling to me. And so it was kind of an interesting thing of realizing like that's where my appetites, if you will, are taking me in a positive direction, I think, overall. But it's kind of an interesting thing where like we are driven to some degree or another by our appetites. I mean, I'm driven by my curiosity. That is an appetite. There's no doubt about it. So I don't want it to come off either like that I'm not driven, for example, by my own appetites. So all right, it's just a question of, are those appetites driving you in a good way or in a bad way? And can you work with those appetites, or are you going to let them control you and basically make you a slave to them, you know.
Do you
And
think it's
I don't
possible
want
to
to be a
change what
slave.
your appetites are?
I think to a certain degree it is. Um, I think, well, let's use alcoholism as an example. Um, if you're familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous or anything along those lines, one of the most telling things about that is that they don't take a will-based approach to working with alcoholism. They take an approach where they basically admit that they, in and of themselves, cannot change this, that they have to work with a higher power. Now, whether that higher power is Jehovah or whatever else, and no judgment on anybody there for whatever your approach to that is. They recognize that they cannot change that appetite in and of themselves. They have to. They need help, and they get help from other people. They get help from other things. So they're able to change that appetite to some degree with the help that they get and with the way they change their relationship to that appetite. But that appetite is still there. And we know this because anybody who is a quote unquote recovering alcoholic will admit that, they're still tempted sometimes to drink. So I think that, it's not a it's yes, we can change our appetites. To a certain extent. I think really we have to come into a different relationship with our appetites. We have to recognize the role our appetites play in our life and what they do for us and where it's beneficial and where it's not, and then ask ourselves what that's worth to us. What is it that we want to change? What is it that we want to transform about it? And how can we do that in a way where we're working with that appetite, but we're not letting it dictate what we need to do? And I think for me, for example, when I go on these alcoholic fasts or other things that I do, like for right now, for example, I have also pretty much weaned myself off of meat. I had shrimp the other night. That's it. I've basically been having a pretty much purely vegetarian diet of late, the last couple of months. And I don't really find that I miss meat that much. I find if anything, like I'm feeling great. And I'm like, okay, so this is something that occasionally my body has wanted in the past, but doesn't need it in order for me to be happy. And I can be satisfied with eating, less meat or eating like only certain types of meat or whatever, or maybe even eventually giving all that up altogether. And not only that, but I can pay close attention to how I feel. And then I do DoorDash sometimes in the evenings. And right now, I'm doing a lot of walking, of course, with DoorDash. I mean, people think it's just driving around, but it's not. You get out of the car and you deliver foods. You're getting you're getting in and out, and you're walking around a lot. And then, of course, I walk in the evenings, and I'm feeling great because of that as well, because I'm really taking good care of myself. Earlier this year, I'd actually gained some weight, and there's a reason I'm going to this story. Because I wasn't taking as such good care of myself, and I and when I realized that, I was like, I got to get this changed. Well, what changed it was choosing to abstain from alcohol, choosing to eat less meat, choosing to go for evening walks, and of course continuing to do the DoorDash. I got my weight back down to where I wanted to be. I actually lost a bit more weight, which I was happy about. And it's not even really about losing weight. It's more about like the fact that I want to feel great in my body. That is an appetite for me. I want to feel good with my body, and I feel great right now. I'm in the best shape of my life. And like that's what I want. I want to feel that way because it feels good, and I feel more in touch with the world around me. I feel more connected. I don't feel so disconnected because I'm not trying to drown myself a certain way. I'm not trying to indulge in appetites and let those appetites control me. I am choosing to take care of myself and be with myself in a really meaningful way. So, can we change our appetites? We can. We just have to find that intrinsic motivation that's going to help us do it. And that's what I'm finding with me.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have any inspiration sources that you'd like to share?
Right now, I'm reading this really amazing book called Articulations by Jeff Brown on love, friendship, and healing. and it's really touching for me. Um, it's a really healing book to read. It's got some great things, and it's one of those books that I find myself picking up each day because he's got these little monographs in there. And then I've got, as I was telling you earlier, I've been reading Bittersweet and Power of Regret. I really like Brené Brown's books also on things in terms of a source of inspiration. And another book I'm reading right now that I really like is called Why We Argue and How to Stop, because I'm trying to have talking about changing appetites or changing a thing about my identity. One of the things that I'm working on is better understanding is coming to a better understanding of my own triggers, if you will, around arguments and like why I can get combative with people at times and what can I do to change that. And how can I shift that? So I'm exploring some of these things. I'm doing a lot of internal work right now, really, and I probably will be for the foreseeable future for the next few months because I'm in a very curious and inquisitive place around certain things that I would like to change about my identity and where I would like to come out, on the other side with a better awareness of how I can show up for myself and with other people in a way that is more collaborative and really is more conscious and aware. Uh, you know, that's the goal and that's the work. So that's kind of what I'm doing and that's inspiring me right now.
Cool. Thank you. I think I missed one of the titles. There was Articulations by Jeff Brown, Bittersweet Power of Regret, Why We Argue and How to Stop. What was the other one?
That was it actually.
Okay,
You got it.
cool. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
What's next for you, sir? You're always working on interesting things.
I am, yeah. Well, the last thing that I did was it's called Flower Mist.
Mm-hmm.
It is a chaos magic grimoire that is framed as a tabletop role-playing game that
Ooh,
takes the concepts of the previous books in the series and turns them into game mechanics.
very cool.
Uh,
Very cool.
yeah, and it's interesting. It's odd because like the way it works is just to summarize it, there's like I have this system that I call suburban Butofu, where there are these 46 different symbols that I call phenomena, things like sidewalks or traffic lights, trees, and flowers. And they each represent a category of processes. And then there are 4 degrees of consciousness, which is what I call them, which there's game, which is the things that you do. There's metagame, which is the things that you desire or the kinds of goals that you have. There is dialectic, which is the way you process information in the world around you. And then there's metadialectic, which is what causes you to change the way you express your game, metagame, and dialectic. And the way you make a character is you put some of these phenomena, things like flowers or lawns or whatever, into each of these 4 categories.
Mm.
And that tells you what you can do, what you can desire, what you can try to achieve, the way that you understand information, and in the context of the conversation, the kinds of questions you ask, and then what causes you to change the way you express those categories. So your character creation is almost like a tarot spread that strictly describes your character's psychology.
Interesting. Very interesting.
I know you also do stuff with I don't know that you magically play tabletop role playing games, but I see you sometimes posting stuff about like board games or role playing games or
Well, I do actually do magical stuff with games, video games and board games, actually. With video games, I actually have an ongoing magical working from a long, 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 long time ago. Where whenever I'm playing a video game, I have a sigil that is designed to activate creativity for me and break through any blockage, writer's block or creative blocks. So every time I'm playing a game, that's kind of an ongoing thing. I've never really felt the need to change that in any way. It just kind of has been exactly what it needed to be, and so that's been that's kind of an ongoing thing. But then, like anytime I play a board game or tabletop or anything like that, I do see it as an act of magic. I actually there's a game I have called Trionimos that I've played where I'll end up creating a sigil with the other people, as we play it, because each time it's a unique shape that gets created. And then, anytime I'm playing a game, I think that it's kind of interesting to just look at the dynamics and the effort involved. And I'm always like, well, like I'm trying to win, and maybe I will, or maybe I won't, but I'm going to go do this, I'm going to do that. And I don't know. It's just sometimes it's just fun to play it. I don't know that I necessarily do everything as an act of magic, but I find that like with playing games, it's just fun to see like what ends up happening and where things go. And it's good fun. It's good brain candy for me.
Yeah, for sure. Hmm. I don't know. I with role-playing games in particular, I think that's it's interesting how it's this form of theater and where you're taking on a role, and if people that you're playing with actually try to act their characters, it's almost like this shared invocation experience if people try to stay in character.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's an active identity work right there, and a changing character and everything else for sure. I think that that's absolutely true and can be a very powerful and an interesting experience in its own right.
Yeah, and tying flower mist back to what we were talking about before, part of the point of the game is that your character, everyone's character, can take these phenomena that are inside of them. Like if you have like a bottle as your metagame, as your appetite, the things that you desire, you can actually rip that out of your character's head and stick it into someone else. Or they could do the same to you. So the whole game is structured around role playing these shifting psychologies. And I hope a little bit of that fruitfully transfers to the people that play it.
I have no doubt it will.
All right. Do you have do you have any other questions that you'd like to ask?
No other questions. No. It's always fun to talk with you and connect with you and catch up with you. It's been a little while. I think the last time we talked was either late last year or early this year, so it's been a little bit of time.
Yeah, it has been a while. Cool. Well, is there anything you'd like to plug?
Sure. I mean, if you want to learn more about me, feel free to check out my website, magicalexperiments.com. I also have a Facebook group, which is called Magical Experiments, which you can check out. And, you can see all the books and things that I've written on the website if you're interested.
Cool. Well, it was great having you, Taylor.
Thank you. Great to be here.